So this is an instance where we don't have menus that say lamb was served, or roast mutton, it would have been at that time, was served with mushroom ketchup very much, but we do have other evidence that shows that this was the norm in Australia. And there were recipes for mushroom ketchup. I said that when it was first, in England, the first recipes appeared in the mid-18th century. Most Australian recipe books at the turn of the century had a recipe for mushroom ketchup. It seemed, I've never made it, but it seems to have been fairly simple. You get your mushrooms, you know, mushrooms have a lot of umami, you add a lot of salt, you let it stand for a while, then you boil it, you might add spices, and you concentrate the flavour. And so as well as, I mean, most of these condiments, as well as having umami, they also have a lot of salt in, so that's another thing that adds to their savouriness. We can also see another evidence of reliance on condiments in these shearers' rations in the 1990. Half a bullet with 4 dozen pickles and 2 gallons of vinegar. No, it doesn't say sauce there, but at least they've got vinegar to things. In the early 20th century, there were some important legal cases that were about developing a basic wage for Australians. At that stage, there wasn't something called a basic wage. But the idea of setting a basic wage came about in the early 20th century. And the way that the basic wage was going to be set was going to be based on the cost of living. And the 2 important components of the cost of living were the cost of rent and the cost of food. So many experts, academics, doctors, university professors, were called upon to give their ideas as to what was nutritionally appropriate, what gave a balanced diet, what was nutritionally appropriate for a family, so that it could be costed and included in the estimates of cost of living for the basic wage. And here is Professor Chapman, who was from the University of Sydney, giving his estimate of weekly rations for a family of 5. So a fair bit of meat, 20 pounds of meat a week. And then you see the condiments, a bottle of tomato or Worcestershire sauce, a pint of vinegar, mustard and curry powder. So they were very much a part of these sorts of condiments were very much a part of Australian eating in the early years of the 20th century. Now, I said that Australians took to tomatoes more rapidly than did the English, and did a lot more things with them than did the English, because we had more tomatoes. Tomato sauce was first produced commercially in 1868 in Australia, so it's got a long history. And there were also, if you look at the recipe books, they all had recipes for tomato chutney, tomato relish, tomato catsup, tomato pickle, and so on. Here's a recipe for tomato relish. Miss Shower, who was who wrote the equivalent of the Green and Gold in Queensland. This is a page from the 2nd edition of the Barossa Cookery book, and it has, in its 400 recipes, 5 recipes for tomato sauce, 4 recipes for tomato chutney, 1 recipe for green tomato pickles, 1 for tomato chow chow, and 2 for Worcestershire sauce. Now, most recipe books would only have 1 recipe for each of those, but because the recipes in the Barossa cookbook were contributed, they put everybody's recipe in, so there are a lot more, but it does give some idea of the importance of these condiments in the Australian kitchen. And not only were they used with cold meat, they were also used in dishes, made-up dishes with cold meat. The cold meat cookery section was usually an important part of recipe books. And recipe books also advertised the various relishes. This company I have never heard of, but it obviously made chutneys and Worcestershire sauce and various condiments. Leon Perrins was advertised, and you can see what they're advertising it as, what they say that the condiment will do. In this case, it takes away any trace of insipidity that might be in a soup. And similarly with pick-me-up sauce, it adds a zest to soups, cold meats, etc. I'm not sure if pick-me-up was an Australian invention. There was a pick-me-up factory in Newtown in Sydney, which I don't think exists anymore, but I think pick-me-up was, it became a sort of brand name like Hoover, but that was invented here. Now that was in the home, but also in Sydney restaurants and in other restaurants, the condiment, the selection of condiments was always on the table for you to add to your grills or whatever it was that you ordered. Here is Kenneth Slessor talking about Sydney restaurants in the 1920s and 1930s, and they always had Worcestershire sauce, anchovy sauce, mushroom sauce, and other pungent condiments. Now I'm sure that these Farlettes and Café Francais were a bit more upmarket, but even in the pubs, the cafes, you would have also had the selection of condiments to add to your meal. So this shows that these umami contributing foods were very, very important in Australian eating habits for quite a long time. And round about the time that Kenneth Slessor was writing what the grill rooms that he was talking about in the 1920s, we suddenly then had, in the mid-1920s, Vegemite, and our love affair, if you like, with umami continued. So while it might have taken Australians a long time to get their tongues around a foreign word, and perhaps even longer, to get rid of the for paradigm in their minds, at least in respect of tastes, they were unknowingly appreciating umami for a long, long time, and we still do, even though we might have it in a different range of dishes in a multicultural Australia that we are in today. Thank you.